Today on the podcast, I sat down with Dana Syracuse and Josh Boehm of Paul Hastings. Dana and Josh are two of the most active lawyers in the industry when it comes to stablecoin licensing, and they've been especially active on OCC applications. This was a great conversation that touched on some of the latest developments on the regulatory side of the industry. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Dana and Josh of Paul Hastings.
Matt Walsh and Nick Carter are partners at Castle Island Ventures. All views expressed by them or the guests on this podcast are solely their opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Castle Island Ventures. Guests and hosts may maintain positions in the assets discussed in this podcast. You should not treat any opinion expressed by anyone on this podcast as a specific inducement to make a particular investment or follow a particular strategy, but only as an expression of their personal opinion. This podcast is for informational purposes only.
Brought down by bad mortgage investments, Lehman, which has 25,000 employees, will be liquidated.
The federal government loans American International Group, AIG, $85 billion.
This is a different kind of market, and the Fed is asleep.
The federal government is stepping in to stabilize Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two mortgage giants that have been threatened by the housing crisis.
The Bank of England has pumped £75 billion more into Britain's ailing economy with a new round of quantitative easing.
You print a couple $1 trillion, and all of a sudden, people start to worry. So out of this worry, we have something called the Bitcoin.
Dana and Josh, welcome back to the podcast. Always good to talk about regulatory developments. Been about a year since the last time you guys were on, so I'm not going to make you do the recap of your introductions, but feel free to splice that into the responses here. Would love to just hop into it, and maybe Dana, starting with you. A lot has changed in terms of the OCC and their role in this industry. So maybe if you could just speak broadly to what you're seeing, what type of companies are going this path. I know you guys at Paul Hastings are probably working with 5 or 6 of these companies that are going the OCC path.
Great to be here. It's definitely been a really fascinating year. And last time that we were on, I don't think there was really any way to predict the level of engagement that we're seeing from the OCC right now through the application process and then going on through supervision. What the Genius Act is meant to reducing ambiguity in identifying the standards that these companies are going to be held to. And the other thing that we're seeing is feels like there's a good amount of cooperation between the regulator in these applications and through the supervision process and the applicants, but also among the regulators that also supervise and examine and license stablecoin issuers. It's really, the environment has moved. Been doing this for a very long time, and you've done multiple bank level charters through the years. And it's interesting to see how the narrative has shifted among entities from regulation stifles innovation to, no, we just need a clear set of rules that we can follow. Now, a lot's going to be worked out through rulemaking, and that will then influence things like custody, reserve, composition, ultimately management of reserves, things like that. But it's really interesting to see how things have solidified nicely.
And Josh, maybe building on that, would love to just talk through what you guys are seeing in terms of the consideration set for companies that are moving into that OCC framework, deciding whether or not to do it. And then also just curious about what it means to run a business once you have a conditional charter.
Great questions. First of all, echo Dana's thanks for the opportunity to join today. Yeah, the world's really changed since the last time we joined you in late 2024, I believe. It's been a substantial change on the federal side in terms of policy toward digital asset companies. And as Dana mentioned, a lot more openness to chartering digital asset firms for custody, purchase, sale activities of digital assets. And we've seen that through a number of applications and now some conditional approvals that the OCC has granted late last year. No great secret, in the 4 years prior, there really wasn't much action at the federal level. It was really, you needed to find a state charter of some kind or money transmitter license to do those sorts of activities. But for a company that is exploring, is a right thing for me. A key thing to understand right out of the gate, it is a banking charter. And although the door is open, there's still a real process that you have to go through. You have to develop an extensive business plan, make sure you've got directors and officers in place, develop a path to profitability, and develop good pro forma financial statements to say that you can become profitable even in boom and bust cycles. And then go through a number of questions from the regulator that span a variety of issues, ranging from your information security to your anti-money laundering to your capitalization, among other topics. And then if you get out on the other side of it, you then have to set that bank up and build out a policy and procedure framework and go through examinations that really are bank grade. So There's a lot of power and benefits that come with having that charter, nationwide preemption for the most part, but a lot of responsibilities that come with it as well.
I'm sure your clients are asking you, well, what would happen if we have a new administration and they're less friendly to this industry? Is this OCC path sustainable, durable? How are you guys thinking about those considerations for entrepreneurs?
That's definitely a factor that plays into what path to go down. Choosing a particular licensing regime that's important not just for speed to market, but also for longevity of the model that you're trying to build. And every successful project that we've worked on, the really successful ones, they've got two key things. One is product market fit. We see that with stablecoins and stablecoin issuance, the desire and the ability to accomplish faster, cheaper movement of money. But then it's also regulatory fit. And what that means is not just what is the underlying law, what are the policy positions that have been taken? What's the history of that regulator in the space? Are they here for the long haul? And obviously also, what's the durability of the charter on a long-term basis? Can you grow into both what's legal or permissible, what's permissible from a policy standpoint? Over at the OCC, we have a confirmed comptroller, which we haven't had in many years. And typically when there is a comptroller that's in place for a specified term, they're able to get a lot done. We have a series of interpretive letters on which to rely, and you have a team of people that are opting into wanting to be part of the space, license, regulate, supervise. At the end of the day, as we said in the last podcast, people are policy and they're incredibly influential in the direction that an agency takes, but definitely optimistic on the longevity of that. Similarly, you have, when you're thinking about other charters that are out there and durability of regime, you've got the New York DFS. They were the first to really step into the fray in supervising stablecoin issuance early with guidance that is mirrored in many ways with Genius, and have a massive number of people in place to license, supervise, and regulate these entities. But one of the things we always talk to clients about is you could have, and we've seen this with a lot of different states, fantastic regimes and the law is there. It's all lined up, but there's nobody there if you go to apply. There's nobody there if you go to develop a new product and you want to interact. And it's like tennis. You need to have somebody on the other side that is going to work with you, participate in keeping that ball back and forth. Genius and the National Trust Bank regime that's definitely, I think, kind of like dominated a lot of the discourse over the course of the past year. I think rightfully so. But I think it's really important to emphasize there's no one size fits all approach. And sometimes it is a state trust. Sometimes it is a national trust bank. Sometimes you've seen this, it's out in some of the public dialogue. You'll have companies that will have both for various reasons, or a national trust or a state trust with a series of money transmission licenses. And Josh, when you were earlier talking about applications and the development of those, governance and that corporate structuring and the longevity there is key.
One thing I'll add to that, I think it would be important to watch which regulators end up with a critical mass of applicants and charter holders who focus on digital assets. That was a dynamic we saw in New York. Obviously, it just started with a few back in 2015, but it really built on itself with the commitment that New York showed to regulating digital assets. And you had more and more entities going there because it was known as a regulator that was building a specialized team of regulators who understood this stuff and could supervise it effectively, as opposed to jurisdictions where it's just maybe a one-off. And now we're seeing on the OCC side a whole number of entities going there, and assuming many or most of them get through the process and become chartered, will that create that same critical mass and allow for that pattern recognition and more sustained buy-in on the standpoint of regulator? I think when you have that critical mass, it can help buffer against political changes that may happen in the future.
That makes sense. One consideration that I was thinking about is just would there be enough people at the OCC to get through these things? We had a government shutdown here not too long after everyone started applying, but it seems like they've been turning them around in pretty short order.
They have. There is, from the time of submitting the application through conditional approval, they've been holding pretty close to this 120-day review window. And then the way the process works is, at that point, once you have conditional approval, then they start turning their attention to things like review of policies and the policy development, all leading into a pre-opening exam. So it is beginning to end, lengthy process. You have up to 18 months to meet all your conditions preceding to get operational, but it's about a year's worth of work. And regulators can't be an unfunded mandate. Having the ability to staff appropriately is critical. But the point that Josh was making about critical mass, for a regulator, I think it's really important that they have a good number of entities that they are supervising that have similar business models, because then they develop the pattern recognition that ultimately makes them better at their jobs, which ultimately leads to clearer rules of the road. So it becomes like this virtuous cycle.
And on the resource issue, at least in our experience, our practice, there's a lot of demand for national trust bank charters right now, but we're seeing the OCC meet that. They've got staff to process these applications. There's also a track. We're seeing a smaller number, but growing of digital asset focused companies seeking full service banks. There was one recently approved. That means an entity that actually is taking insured deposits as well. So those are pathways that are both moving right now at the federal level. An interesting new path to watch would be Genius creates a type of federal non-bank stablecoin issuer. And the rules are still being written around that, but those entities would be supervised by the OCC as well. So it'll be important to watch what that path looks like. Will that be a more streamlined type of authorization than having a national trust bank or another type of charter to be a stablecoin issuer? And what the resourcing will look like at the OCC for processing that new federal non-bank option that Genius created.
Yeah, that's a really good dovetail into what I want to talk about next, Josh, which is Genius passed, so the landmark legislation. What next? So maybe you guys could speak a little bit about how things work after bills get passed and the rulemaking process, and maybe with a particular eye on what entrepreneurs in this industry should be thinking about as that rulemaking is happening.
A very good question. Genius was a real landmark piece of legislation. We went from an environment where stablecoins were largely regulated on a state-by-state basis, and Genius creates a federal floor for them and defines what they are, perhaps even more importantly. And that has created a substantial degree of additional institutional interest in stablecoins, legitimizing them as a means for payment, not just in crypto environments, crypto native environments, but also in traditional financial environments as well. But some of the details that would be really important to parties that might hold and use stablecoins in traditional environments are still being built out and need to be detailed in rulemaking. Some of those relate to capital requirements that apply to stablecoin issuers. Those need to be spelled out. Some of the anti-money laundering requirements and details rely on rulemaking. Insolvency protections. There's a lot of good language in there, but some of the details on how that would actually work in practice also need some spelling out as well. So we're expecting a proposed rule shortly, and people in the industry are watching closely to see what that looks like and standing by to comment to the federal agencies on those proposed rules.
If I'm picking up on that thread, we've got clients that are issuing or would like to try to issue under money transmission regimes with an eye towards making sure that what they're building will be Genius compliant and will comport with the rulemaking when that happens, so that they can then essentially apply and lift and shift that issuance over. Yield and rewards and the discussion there about prohibition on interest, there's definitely been significant commentary there. That is the ability to pass on things like rewards, et cetera. That is critical to earlier. It's critical across the industry, but I think also specifically with startup issuers that are trying to enter the marketplace and develop network effects. And if that is no longer a possibility, that will definitely have an impact. The question is, does that cause consolidation amongst those that are already out there and are a little more up to speed? The other area would be the definition of what is a substantially similar framework to Genius. And I think it's important that there be a recognition for high quality state regimes that are already there as being substantially similar. It's important, I think, for the dual banking system. I think it's important for also ensuring that there are multiple regulators out there that are supervising in a high quality fashion. I mentioned New York, but there are other states. Nebraska has a regime. There are a handful of other states that are out there, but certainly New York being early. The other would be, you start to get into the weeds on issues, but settlement times, some of the ambiguities around reserve composition, I think those are all being worked out.
Yeah, it's really interesting on the yield front. The Genius bill goes through and rewards seem like they're fine and people continue to pay them. We're having a huge market structure dust up right now. It's one of the two critical issues that seem to be holding up that bill. And won't put you guys on the spot on prognosticating whether or not this gets passed. I think it was 70% on Polymarket. A couple of days later, it's 50. So it's whipsawing, but it leads you to wonder if that does go through with some sort of a prohibition, if that would also impact just the rulemaking process on Genius. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Well, it's been really interesting to watch the reaction to the yield language in Genius, because it certainly wasn't something that flew under the radar, at least so far as we could tell. We're monitoring that bill pretty closely, and there were different formulations of it through the making of stablecoin legislation. And it landed in a place that, exactly like you said, the statutory text is pretty clear. There's a prohibition on paying interest or rewards solely in connection with holding, use, or retaining the stablecoin. And it also doesn't bar you from paying it if it's going out through someone other than the issuer. So that does leave, at least on the face of the law, a path for issuers who can find a pathway through what the law allows. And I think parties who are opposing that realize that the statutory text is pretty clear and that the agencies are pretty limited in their ability to confine that in the Genius rulemakings, which is why there's this effort to reopen the issue in the context of another law, in this case, the Clarity Act. So it's growing to be a really highly charged issue among bank trade groups, certain exchanges, and other parties. And it's hard to put a number on it. If we knew, Matt, we'd probably be on Polymarket too and try to make money on this, but it's hard to say with any certainty. But so far as we can tell, it's certainly a potential blocker for clarity moving forward.
That's for sure. One of the interesting things too, when you think about Genius rulemaking, is there's things that you have to do. There might be other things on the reserve management side that you would want to do in order for a ratings agency to look favorably upon the stablecoin. So I'm interested to see what that looks like. And I guess that's somewhat of a bet on, will the rating agencies get more active in the space?
Moody's announced a methodology to evaluate stablecoins based upon the asset quality, the market value risk, transparency, liquidity composition. I think what that's doing is it's trying to make it clear that the quality of the underlying reserves is key. You have auditors that obviously they audit the reserves, but they don't tend to not really get into the quality and the ratios of those assets. But it definitely raises a question as to the ability to liquidate the stablecoin, the ability to have access to funds, the potential for, like, if there are certain assets in that basket, in that composition that are deemed to be higher quality, think short-term treasuries. There are only so many of those to go around. Does that create a different market there? Does it influence that market if this notion of rating stablecoins really takes off? Reserve composition also, it's something that it's no one size fits all approach. Companies try to work through what is their white label issuer, what do their customers want to see, those that they're working with in developing those issuances. What will, if they just are issuing their own stablecoin directly to the market, what do they feel is the best composition? So there are going to be so many points beyond, I think, just underlying regulatory requirements that are going to influence that. And it's going to pretty rapidly go beyond just T-bills, reverse repurchase agreements, government money markets, deposit accounts, and kind of like that baseline, give me one of those four or all four, and we'll have external factors that will influence it.
That's a really interesting point. So you're saying if you're creating this reservation bid for short-term U.S. Treasuries, you'd be effectively pushing up the price of those bonds, pushing down the yield. You have some janky issues in the Treasury market potentially if you can't go further out the duration curve.
I'm just saying, if you start looking around the corner and you start looking at various provisions and trends and say, okay, what's the potential knock-on effect there? That could be one. If stablecoins continue to grow the way folks are saying that they will, the way we're seeing it, the activity that we're seeing, it's not beyond reason.
I think that's right. I think the other thing maybe we should all be thinking about is, what would foreign competition look like here? Could you effectively see a euro-dollar market for stablecoins with non-US financial institutions that just decide to pay interest on these things? I wouldn't be surprised at all if you see attempts to do that.
That's a great point, Matt. It's something that I think we want to watch closely for. Genius has a number of provisions around coordination with foreign issuers and foreign regulators. But like some of the other issues we talked about, much of that is left to rulemaking and further build out by the federal regulators. But in the event that you see that euro-dollar analog get built out in non-US jurisdictions, I think we'd expect that there would be some coordination between US regulators and their counterparts around that.
Something else is going to come down to, why is that stablecoin being built and constructed? Is it cross-border payments? Is it vendor management, vendor payment? I think that will then influence that type of reserve model that you're describing.
That makes sense. One of the things maybe to double click on market structure, why people are so excited about this is that it could bring to life the tokenization category in a way that hasn't really existed. People have been talking about this for 10 years, bringing securities on chain, but what good is it to bring them on chain if there's no secondary market liquidity, if it's not clear how you need to issue these things? So I hope we get the bill, but I guess there's another path to get it via rulemaking. I'm certainly seeing a lot of startup activity in this category. Curious if you guys have thoughts on tokenization broadly and what you guys are seeing.
We're certainly seeing a lot of activity there as well, Matt. And in terms of the regulatory clarity that's needed for it, I think for the sort of tokenization you're referring to, where we are trying to bring money market funds on chain or an analog like that, there's largely sufficient tools under existing law for that, or things that can be cleared up with rulemakings. And it's not evident we need total statutory overhaul that clarity would provide to make that possible. I think when you're looking at more crypto native assets and assets where there's some ambiguity as to what the thing even is as a threshold matter, how you will classify it, that's where having Congress come in and speak on that and divide it up into CFTC jurisdiction versus SEC jurisdiction, where that will be critically important. I think it's notable that the chairs of the SEC and CFTC have indicated that they, regardless of whether clarity comes to pass, would intend to use their available powers to help provide that sort of clear rules of the road for tokenized assets and how they can be supported by different market participants.
Yeah, I think that just the clarity around the sponsor level. So if you're a large asset manager that wants to bring a credit fund on chain, but you want there to be secondary market liquidity, you might not feel comfortable coming in right now with or without that secondary market liquidity. But having ATS venues that can actually operationalize this is just going to make it so much more exciting.
That goes to how built out is that digital asset tokenization value chain from token issuance to listing, compliance, trading, collateral management, custody, smart contract servicing, the digital asset analog to the current value chain. We've done projects involving tokenization of real world assets, tokenized gold, other commodities. There are tokenized money market fund projects. There are tokenization of carbon credits. There are various efforts underway. And down the line, things like tokenization of intangible assets like music royalties could become a very real thing. But market structure, it is exciting, but I think there's still a question of specifically like where is new law required. So for some of these tokenization projects, these endeavors, looking at things like the UCC for a determination of what does that token legally represent? Does it represent my ability to redeem, or is it something else? And I think taking it back to like product market fit, is there a real problem that's being resolved? With every crypto cycle, you see these tokenization projects, and if it's too early, or maybe it is something where overcoming that cold start problem is going to be difficult, or there's inadequate technology infrastructure to support tokenization. So there's scalability is different, would be difficult, or custody would be difficult. Yeah, I think with any of these projects, it's important to look back and say, okay, on previous cycles, custody, why did that work? Clear defined need, and there was a legal lineup, similar like stablecoins today we're talking about.
I would just add, I think on the topic of the secondary market complexities that you're referring to, Matt, involving tokenized assets, that has been an issue for years. Even if you can get clarity on the treatment of the issuer, what's the downstream effect? And how can ETSs and other venues support those assets in a way that complies with their regulatory requirements and expectations? Again, hopefully there is a comprehensive approach to clarifying all of that with a federal law, but would note that, at least in our experience, SEC's doors are open again for people to come in and have conversations with the relevant folks in the divisions and the crypto task force to say, look, if there is a concrete fix or change that's needed and there's a statutory basis for it, there really is a receptiveness to hearing those arguments and walking through that with market participants in a way that just wasn't the case in the 4 years prior to last.
I would echo that. I mean, that has been such a pleasant surprise to see the SEC crypto working force, the task group, whatever they're calling it, just with all the information in public. You can look at the PowerPoint deck of everyone that goes in and visits with them. You can see the written feedback. I think the transparency out of the SEC on this has just been amazing.
Exactly. And the SEC, that's been very, very positive. And I think that should be true regardless of your views on the underlying policy issues. Having a transparent approach where market participants can come in and make these arguments, I think, is a good thing. so that these ideas can all be aired out in a transparent way. I would also mention that that's meant true across other regulators. Again, if you are trying to explore a bank charter or a novel idea with the OCC through the course of exploratory meetings with the staff there, if one of the products or services that would be in your bank model would go beyond what the OCC has said they would consider permissible in the letters to date, they want to hear those arguments. And there's an avenue to advocate for why what you're doing should be seen as falling within one of those letters, or it's just an incremental step beyond and should still be considered permissible. So we are seeing that across federal agencies, and that's consistent with the policy that we've seen at the top regarding digital assets.
One of the things that's interesting is I think you'll probably see this phase shift in the types of projects that launch tokens over the next few years if you continue to get this regulatory clarity, where right now, I think the perception in some parts of the industry is that the token market is dead. And maybe it is, because a lot of these are just superfluous, quote unquote, governance tokens that don't really do anything. But like the time is coming where you'll actually be able to launch tokens that have security-like properties, or maybe they are in fact securities at the protocol layer. So maybe that ends up just being better for everyone, where you can start to think about these on a fundamental basis and there's actually a framework. So that's what I'm hoping we get towards as part of this market structure overhaul.
I agree. Really getting down to the practical reality of what is the token, what rights and benefits does it confer versus some associated set of promises or contracts. And I know that's something that Bill would attempt to do, to separate it out in a real clear authoritative way that's not relying on decades of judge-made law that's not terribly consistent across different courts, that you could have a digital commodity that can be the subject of an investment contract, but isn't an investment contract or a security itself. Having that delineation very clear would absolutely be helpful to have as a matter of federal law, because that's something that the SEC is limited in its ability to do by guidance or rulemaking, because they just can't override federal case law. So that's a very important point, and one that would be useful to add in federal law.
On one hand, it seems like everything's going great here from a regulatory perspective. We're getting clarity on a number of issues. Obviously, Genius passed. You've seen just tons of companies enter the stablecoin space. Volumes are up and to the right on all of these companies that are in that ecosystem. Market structure, we know what the big issues are, and we'll see where that ends up. But what are you guys worried about? Is there anything that the industry should be aware of or pushing for at this point? I'm curious if you guys have a perception that there are other things that we need to really focus on as an industry.
One key issue is how the regulatory landscape around anti-money laundering, Bank Secrecy Act, sanctions rules will be applying to tokenized assets, and in particular, out in DeFi environments, as different projects continue to mature. The guidance around that is still being developed, and the law is very, very broad on a number of those topics. In Genius, there is supposed to be a rulemaking that will add clarity around, what particular things an issuer of a stablecoin is responsible for versus things that they're not responsible for once the token's in the wild. I think that sort of delineation of responsibility between regulated parties and people using a tokenized asset out in the wild, I think will be critically important, especially as institutions start to get involved in a deeper, more comprehensive way, to know that, if I'm engaging with this asset, I'm not carrying some edge risk that I could be, subject to sanctions concerns, depending on what someone that I'm transacting with may have done with the token before I received it.
Yeah, some of the concerns there from the infrastructure bill a few years ago.
Exactly.
I agree wholeheartedly there. I mean, that is something that can have lengthy statute of limitations periods attached to it. It's something that you can start getting into, well, I'm not a regulated entity because I'm not actually providing custody. And then you start parsing out, are you or are you not providing regulated services? Are you or are you not a custodian? And I think things could devolve from there. This notion of transaction monitoring obligations versus the ability to do ecosystem-wide monitoring. And if you have access to data that shows that an asset has been moved through a sanctioned entity or gone through the hands of a sanctioned party, what does that mean for you? What does that mean in an environment where there is a shifting political landscape, where there is the ability, say down the line, there is the ability to bring enforcement because the laws were unclear at the time, so people didn't know exactly what they were supposed to do. One, There could be strict liability associated with it, but also very significant fines that could be associated with it as well.
That makes sense. Well, guys, this has been great. Obviously, it just feels like night and day from the last time you guys were on here and we were talking about a bunch of problems. It seems like now we have some solutions for companies in this industry, and particularly around the OCC path, I think, for a number of companies you guys are working with. Where can we send people to get in touch with you guys over at Paul Hastings and learn more?
Yeah, you can find our profiles on the Paul Hastings website. Dana Syracuse.
Josh Boehm, also on the Paul Hastings website. And yeah, looking forward to engaging with folks who'd like to explore what their regulatory path might be. Would note that we are in a regulatory window right now where there are a number of options open. Those windows don't stay open forever. And especially for stablecoin issuers or people trying to be stablecoin issuers, Genius will likely come into effect in less than a year. So having a strategy for how you'd want to become Genius compliant is something to look at sooner rather than later, given that fast approaching effectiveness date of Genius.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, thanks for coming on. Talk to you guys soon.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of On the Brink with Castle Island. To learn more about Castle Island, visit castleisland.vc. And to listen to all of our podcast episodes, please visit castleisland.vc/podcast or just click on the tab on our website. Thanks for listening.